In today's video, I'll be painting one of my all-time favorite characters in the Horus Heresy Lore to a parade-ready standard.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching Talon's Miniatures.
I'm of course talking about Argel Tal, the Crimson Lord of the Gal Vorbak, and one of the main reasons we will all hate Erebus forever.
His latest resin sculpt is absolutely fantastic, and while I'll be putting my own spin on it, I'll try to stay true to the original color scheme. He has quite a unique look, but you could use the same method I employed for the armor to paint your Word Bearer's Chaos Space Marines, and the wing and the demonic flesh method could be used to paint your possessed. I started from a Zenithal highlight to create some pre-shading and to make sure my colors will be nice and vibrant over the white. If you want to learn more about how to do a Zenithal highlight, check out my dedicated video on the channel. Before anything else, I wanted to find the right colors to use for my base coats and to get them all onto the model so I can start shading and highlighting after.
An important disclaimer about the paints. Most of the colors I will be using are from the Chimera colors range. But wherever I can, I will also list what I think a Citadel color equivalent could be, so you can follow along if you use that range.
Just keep in mind that Chimera colors are in most cases simply better, which is why I use them instead of Citadel, so the end result might be slightly different. I started by painting all the corrupted flesh Argel Tal has in his transformed demonic form. I went for a pure magenta color from Chimera, but you could use something like Screamer Pink from Citadel instead. The idea here is to have something relatively dark but very colorful as our base layer, so later I can simply highlight up with more desaturated colors without losing all the vibrancy and also without having to use any washes. For all the membranes of the wings, I use salmon skin from Chimera. If I had to use Citadel, I would probably replace it with red skin flesh. I wanted to have a different color on the wings from the rest of the skin on his body, and since the body was so pinkish due to the magenta, I wanted to bring this closer to yellow. This color is not exactly great at coverage, so this is a good point to remind ourselves about how important it is to achieve full coverage on all our base coats. With some colors you can get away with applying 1 or 2 coats and that's enough. With some colors like this one, it's perfectly fine and absolutely necessary to use 3 or 4 coats. The 2 thin coats rule is like the pirate code, more what you would call a guideline than an actual rule, so don't be afraid to bend it. Because there is only one hard rule of miniature painting that you can never bend. Always wait for your first coat to dry before you apply the next one. Break that at your own peril. For the rest of the bones and muscles connected to the wings, I used darkness from Chimera. I wanted to have something that is dark but with some color in it and not just straight up black like in the original color scheme. This one is a bit tricky to find an equivalent for. My closest estimate would be to take a Gal Vorbak red, which is quite appropriate to the subject by the way, and mix it with some black. Speaking of black, I used some pure black to paint everything that was supposed to be either metallic or black later on, plus all the flexible soft joints of the armor. For the unfortunate Space Marine who is experiencing a pretty shitty day at the hands of our handsome hero, I chose phthalo blue red shades to make him an ultramarine. And yes, I know that I always paint ultramarines everywhere, but this time there is an actual lore reason behind it, since we all know who the Emperor sent to Monarchia and what they did there. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I suggest reading The First Heretic by Aaron Dembski-Baldwin. It's one of the best stories in the Horus Heresy. Finally, it's time to base coat the actual armor panels, or at least the ones that are still visible after the demonic transformation. I use Cartacci red for this, which looks way more like a vivid primary red than the original paint job, but I will fix some of that later, plus my intention is to make it a more colorful scheme in general. As a Citadel equivalent, you could use some corn red instead of the Cartacci red, although it is more bluish, but you can compensate later with less shading and more highlighting with Mephiston red. Finally, I added some terrain paste over the whole base to cover the rest of the unpainted surface, and I was done with the base coating, so let's move on to the shading and highlighting. My first order of business in this step was to get the armor and the wings in a shape that allows me to finish them a bit later with some simple edge highlights. For that I needed to add some depth to the armor, plus I needed to bring the tone closer to the color that we associate with Word Bearers. So I mixed some black into the original Cartacci red that I used to base coat the armor and loaded the mix into the airbrush. You don't need a lot of black in there. If you add too much it will just look black. Ideally the mix should be still red but darkened down to the color of dried blood. With the airbrush I shoot this from below, creating some transitions on the armor panels, but I also use it to darken down the wing membranes. On the armor panels I was concentrating on the areas that would be in shadow, but leaving enough space untouched so that there is room for the highlights as well, leaving the original color in between. On the wings I concentrated on the edges of the wing segments, leaving the middle untouched so that I can highlight that later. And once I was happy with the result, I replaced the mix in the airbrush with some diluted down deep rusto and used it to darken the deepest shadows even further down, while also adding some additional purple tone into the shadows. If you use Citadel paints, you could use some Leviathan purple contrast for this final step of the shading through the airbrush, with the added benefit that you wouldn't even have to thin it down. And having finished with the shading, I continued on with the highlights, still using the airbrush for now. I added a little white to my original base color of salmon skin on the wings, and I used this mix to create a highlight in the middle of the membrane segments, the parts that I left unpainted during the shading. If you add a little too much white and the skin loses too much color, you can do what I did and use some very diluted salmon skin to glaze over the whole wing and bring back the color to the skin. Moving on to the red armor, I loaded some thinned down the red from Chimera, or Mephiston red for the Citadel folks, and shot this from a zenithal angle at the armor panels. Unfortunately, the camera was fascinated by Argel Tal's wings and kept focusing on that instead of where I was actually shooting. I hope my wife can find some pieces of footage to show you what I did here. Sorry about that. But with that, I was done with the airbrush and I switched back to the brush for the rest of the project. I used my favorite easy method to shade the base and simply slathered some Agara's Dunes contrast over it. And then mixed some Carthage red and black again, watered it down, and with a nice sharp brush dropped this mix into the cracks of Argel Tal's armor to create more contrast and detail by some recess shading. Alright, with that all the shading is officially done, it's time to move on to the highlighting. I started with the demonic flesh again, and remember that here I painted on the darkest color that I wanted to have in the shadows. Now all I needed to do was to layer it up from there. I mixed the original salmon skin with pink skin from Chimera and essentially just used an overbrushing technique on the whole surface. You can use Kislev Fresh from Citadel instead of the pink skin for a similar effect. The way this works is that the skin details are very well sculpted on the model, so I just needed to thin down the mix, and then by exerting little pressure over the surface I made sure that all the raised surfaces got covered. Then I repeated the same process, but this time with pure pink skin and even less pressure, trying to only get this paint over the previous layer, but making sure some of the previous mix still remains visible. If you feel you need to go higher in brightness, you can mix in a little white into the pink skin and highlight even further. Later I will come back to the skin a bit. For now I felt it was good enough, so I moved on to the armor. I was searching for the right color to do the edge highlights on the armor, but it proved to be quite tricky. Finally I ended up with a mixture of the red plus cold yellow plus white, which produced an orangish peach color. I used this to trace every single edge on the armor, including all the cracks and holes as well. If you want to improve your edge highlighting skills, I have a video on the subject on the channel, so check that out. Finally, I edge highlighted all the most prominent upward facing edges with pure warm yellow. If I was using Citadel colors, I would probably go with the good old Troll Slayer orange and Fire Dragon Bright combination for these two highlights. But since I already had the warm yellow on my brush, I used it to trace all the veins on the wings as well. They are sculpted on relatively nicely, so I could just edge highlight them in some places by running the side of the brush over them. But in some places this was not possible because the detail is not raised enough or because of the curve of the wing. So sometimes I simply had to brace my hands well and use the tip of the brush to trace them along the wing. Once I had all the veins marked with the warm yellow, I switched to cold yellow, and I did the same thing but a little thinner and only concentrating on the most raised parts of the veins. You could use Fleshgit's yellow for this if you use the Citadel range. At this point it looked quite good, but I felt that it lacked a bit of depth because there was no separating dark lining between the veins and the rest of the wing. To fix it, I used some Nezrag yellow contrast paint over all the veins, making sure that it covers a little around them as well and not just on the top of them. Unfortunately, this darkened down my highlights quite a bit, so I had to come back and redo some of the cold yellow highlights later. If you want to do this better than I did, then apply the Nezrag yellow before the highlights, not after them. But since I was already working on the wings, I decided to finish the rest of the colors on them too. I used a mix of salmon skin plus white to highlight all the edges of the skin and also the edges of the ribs in the skin. Once again, some of it can be done with the side of the brush, but especially the ribs and the tears need to be traced with the tip of the brush. All the other things on the wings, basically all the things I painted with darkness, were a bit trickier to highlight. I mixed in some bone khaki into the darkness for the first highlight, and if you followed my advice of Gal Vorbak red mixed with black for the Citadel version, then now you can add some Zendri dust into the mix. The method I use here is the same overbrushing I was using on the demonic flesh, dragging the side of the brush over the raised elements with very little pressure. But the dilution of the paint is very important here. You should paint with a dilution that is more watered down than what you would traditionally use for layering, but not enough to make the paint flow away from the brush and pull into the recesses. If you do it correctly, the separation line between the layers won't be noticeable and you won't need any glazing to hide it due to how detailed the surface is. For the final highlight I did the same thing, but this time with pure bone khaki and a thicker dilution, mostly focusing it on the edges on the wing and the horn on his head. The end result looked quite good, but I thought the highlights were a bit too harsh and the whole thing became too washed out and devoid of color. The solution was some sepia ink, but you could also just use some skeleton horde contrast. I painted this all over my previous highlights, and the end result is much darker, yellower, and somewhat shiny, which is due to the glossiness of the ink, but that's exactly what I wanted. At this point I went back to the original demonic skin to fix the highlights. Initially I just added more white into the pink skin to bring the brightness up, but something was missing, so I thought maybe adding a little yellowish color might do the trick. I took some radiant flash from AK Interactive and used tiny amounts of it in the brightest areas, which made me like the end result way more. Maybe some Bestigor flash from Citadel could be a good alternative here. At this point most of the model was done, and I just had to complete some small but quite important elements. The metal symbol of the serrated sun on Argel Tal's chest is quite prominent on the model, so it had to look good. I decided to go for something simple but striking, essentially one big color transition from dark to almost white with all the edges highlighted to represent non-metallic metal. First I used graphite, painted all the edges and glazed it from the bottom towards the top of the symbol, making sure that it fully covers on the top. Then I switched to medium gray, painted all the upward facing edges on the entire symbol and continued the big highlight, but now only inside the previous color. Finally I used some silver gray to paint only some of the most prominent edges and the very top of the symbol. My best guess at Citadel equivalents for those colors would be Dawnstone, Administratum Grey, and maybe Grey Seer at the end. Another very important element of the model is the green glow of Argel Tal's demonic eye. I made sure that the whole eye socket was painted black, then I covered the raised lens inside the socket with pure white. And once it was dry I painted some fluorescent green paint over the whole thing. This should result in a nice bright lens and some green OSL effect on everything around it. The only thing left to do was the unfortunate torn in half ultramarine. I simply highlighted the armor by adding more and more white into the original Chimera blue, highlighting all the edges, adding some volumetric highlights and small scratches here and there. For his gold armor trim and imperial symbols I used my standard gold non-metallic metal recipe, going from whole red and highlighting up with Sahara yellow, dirty yellow, and finally adding some very bright elements with pale yellow. Now I was really in the home stretch, but this is the time to add some cool little elements that usually take very little time but can add a lot to the end result. The thing that bothered me about the original art is that while the ultramarine is torn in half, the blood is somehow missing and we can't have that, right? So I added a couple of tufts to the base and one in particular right under the torso of the ultramarine, and then I used the only paint I still like from my original army painter set, the effect paint Glistening Blood. When you paint this on, the result looks quite unnaturally purple, but when it dries it looks exactly as it should. So I painted this all over the severed torso of the Space Marine, dripping down into the vegetation, and also created a pool around the rest of him on the ground. And with that I was quite happy with the Chapter Master of the Serrated Suns and called it a day, and the final result looks like this.
Thank you very much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and maybe learned something new that you can use for your own projects. Let me know in the comments whether I managed to do Argel Tal justice and what you would have done differently. And don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons. See you guys in the next one.